Hey there, Watershed. David Roberts here with this week's installment of Theological Thursdays. As always, if you're not familiar with Theological Thursdays, this is when we kind of do a deeper dive into maybe a question or an idea that was introduced or raised in the message from the previous Sunday. And so, for those of you who are just kind of jumping in, we are still in our Different World as Possible series, and we're going to be kind of reflecting on the talk that one of our teaching pastors, Sean Bowers-Buxton, gave this last Sunday, which was really centered around the theological discipline or discourse around liberation theology. So if you've never heard or experienced or studied or been exposed to kind of what broadly gets categorized or considered liberation theology, then first things first, if you didn't listen to Sean's talk, then you're already in the right place. You're on Watershed YouTube channel if you're watching this, I'm guessing. Stop watching me and go back and listen to Sean's talk, because it's a phenomenal introduction, both at kind of like the academic, technical, and experiential narrative level. Sean is able to weave together many of her own personal experiences growing up in the global South with her more academic understanding of the contributions of liberation theology. And so check that out. She makes a great resource recommendation in the form of a book that is a good primer for anyone who wants to do a little further reading. And I can make some recommendations on that front as well if anyone has more questions. So, you know, if you listen to Sean's talk on Sunday and you're like, this is awesome, I can't get enough of it, shoot me an email at david@watershed.charlotte.com. And not only will I re-recommend the book that Sean mentioned during her talk, but I can give you some additional book, podcast, video, YouTube video resources. But what I wanted to spend a couple minutes kind of reflecting on today is even kind of this notion of liberation theology as a kind of contextual theology. If you don't know what I mean by that, think of the ways that, you know, if you spent any time in church or in Christian settings, academic or otherwise, how oftentimes you have kind of general theology on the one hand, and then on the other hand, especially maybe if you're in a more progressive setting like Watershed, you're aware of all of these other kinds of theology. So maybe Sunday wasn't the first time you'd heard of liberation theology. You know, maybe a few weeks ago, at the end of our previous series, you heard Tommy Alka and I talk about queer theology. Perhaps you've been exposed to feminist, black, or womanist theology. There are other strands of theology, around other sort of identitarian categories. There's Asian theology, Chinese theology, to be more specific. Lots of different contextual theologies, typically organized around some sort of identity marker, but not always. So if that's all true, then what are we categorizing as just theology as such? Typically, it's going to be systematic theology. And to differentiate systematic from biblical theology might be more descriptive in what it looks at. It's just merely kind of describing what's going on in the biblical text. It's looking at the history and the context of Scripture and kind of forming conclusions that maybe we wouldn't even agree with now, but would have kind of made sense in the context of the time. Whereas systematic theology is going to be more prescriptive. Here's what we should believe and why in some sort of universal sense. The problem is, typically, systematic theology has been considered universal in some real sense, when it is in fact typically itself contextual. Much of what we think of as theology proper these days is heavily influenced by maybe Reformation theology, kind of born out of the Reformation period about 500 years ago, which was centered around certain parts of Central Europe, very German, Swiss. That's where Martin Luther and John Calvin are from. Going to be importing influences in that sense, a little bit from like the patristic period, which means it's going to have a Greek influence at times, as well as a kind of Mediterranean influence, Latin, and kind of the reception of Latin, especially in the Roman Catholic Church, is going to play into that. None of this is necessarily crucial for you to remember in this moment. I'm kind of just throwing out examples to show that what we typically think of as proper theology, in contrast to some of these more modern contextual theologies around identity, is in fact itself also contextual. Yeah. And so liberation theology is incredibly important in my opinion, and I love that we are, as a community, kind of getting into discourse around it and allowing it to influence and even critique many of our inherited and received theologies. What I want to emphasize, though, is that in celebrating and studying and exploring the insights of liberation theology, queer theology, or womanist or feminist theology, all of which I think we should do, what I don't want us to get into the habit of is contrasting those with regular or normal theology over here. Kind of the big idea I'm kind of trying to land today is that all theology is contextual. All theology is being done and explored and considered through a particular social location. Sometimes that involves identity, and I think the best theologies actually complicate our identities. They reveal the inadequacies of our identities because often it is identity that we're leaning on in order to secure ourselves. Identity can create hierarchies and things like that way. So theology in many ways isn't always a defense of identity. One of the beautiful things about queer theology is the way that it complicates or problematizes identity. But that doesn't mean that theology is ever exploring or speaking from some sort of objective, transcendent, universal position. It's always speaking from below, kind of within a context, exploring the ways that we think about God, think about what is normal or normative, think about the way that our societies and our systems are ordered, whether we consider them to be divinely ordained or naturally the way things are. All of that is the subject of theology, and it's always already contextual. So that's really all I wanted to kind of add. I thought Sean did a phenomenal job of kind of just giving us a very accessible and practical introduction to liberation theology. Like I said, if you are looking for more resources on that front, the first thing I would do is check out the book Sean recommended. And then beyond that, feel free to email myself, or I'm sure you could also reach out to Sean, and she would be very receptive to share some of her own recommendations as well. But thanks for tuning in. If you haven't already, do subscribe. Please always, we're going to constantly be pushing that. In addition to Theological Thursdays, the Watershed YouTube channel is a phenomenal resource whether it's sharing a message with someone who doesn't go to Watershed, who you think it would be meaningful for, from Sunday, to resources for small group and block leaders and things like that. So stay subscribed. It's going to be the fastest way to kind of get some video-based resources that pertain to what's going on here in the Watershed. So yeah, thank you, and we will see you next week for another edition of Theological Thursday.